alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Hello and welcome to Alive After Reading. I'm Tim Niederreiter, and with me today is a new guest to the podcast, Kristi Charish. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here today.
Well, it's always great to talk to people, especially people who, write fantasy especially. But, I mean, any writer is a fun guest, and that is the majority of my guests. So, Kristi, what sort of stuff do you write, and what's your background like? What brings you to writing, I guess?
I'm an oddball, but then saying that, I guess every writer on the face of the planet probably comes at things from an odd angle. I started off my adult career in the sciences. So my main sort of background is I'm a geneticist and cell biologist. I did a bachelor's and then a master's and then a PhD in cell biology and genetics. So I'm kind of a lab, I guess, recovering lab rat. But I loved science fiction and fantasy. I've always read it. I've always devoured it, and that's kind of always been my literary drug of choice. And while I was doing my degree, I would, in my downtime, I'd be reading, and and I'd also be playing a lot of RPG video games while I would be running the computers in the back, or the microscopes and the various computers that process our data in the background. And as I got closer and closer to the end of my PhD and getting ready to defend my thesis, I started looking at what did my future look like. And it was going to be... it was essentially, I was trained for an academic laboratory job, which is basically not doing experiments anymore and not doing all the fun science stuff, but writing papers and teaching. And I quickly came to the realization that wasn't quite the direction I wanted to go anymore. So what to do? And I kind of played this mental game where I was like, well, if I could do anything in the world and get paid for it, what would that be? And I'm like, I'd love to be an author. And I started playing around with the idea, not really thinking that I would get anywhere with it. And by the time I was ready to defend my PhD, I also had a novel, because I would spend my time half writing my PhD, and then I'd get a couple of hours for writing my novel. And I just sort of kicked off. That was my first novel that got published, Owl in the Japanese Circus, which is urban fantasy.
Oh, cool. Yeah. First try. Knocked it out of the park.
Yeah. About an ex-archaeology graduate student turned international antiquities thief, which, I was writing the kinds of things I wanted to read, and I enjoyed reading. So I sent it out to agents, again, not really figuring that I'd do 100 agents and then I'd look at self-publishing it. And within the first 10 or 20 agents I submitted to, I got some requests, and I signed with my agent that I have now, Carolyn Ford, and the next thing I know, she had it sold to Simon & Schuster.
Wow, big deal.
Which ended up a four book deal.
Ooh. And
then before the first book came out, I had another novel I'd started writing, which was Kincaid Strange, so the Voodoo Killings, which ended up being called the Voodoo Killings. We could talk about how books get named.
Oh boy,
that's an interesting thing. She sold that to Random House for a 3-book deal. And the last book just came out last year in that series. So I quickly ended up with 2 book series and 7 books that I was under contract to produce during my postdoc. So a bit of an odd direction for a research scientist to go, but I've never looked back. So both urban fantasy series.
And a very strong career change. Let me put it that way. I mean, that's very successful initially compared to a lot of people I know. There's one of these old sayings: the harder I try, the luckier I get. But I certainly did end up with a lot of luck lining up. It's a career change, but I'll tell you, it's next to impossible to leave the science behind, and that was something that I've had, a lot of my editors and some of my readers pick up on is, that there's science in there, and I don't even know I'm putting it in. They'll say, "Oh wow, there's this cool science," and I'm like, "Oh, I hadn't thought of it that way," but you're right. I didn't. I can't get rid of it. It's part of my brain now. So yeah. So that's me. Oh, cool. That's a nice capsule, actually. I mean, even with a little bit of a ramble at the end. But hey, we're not against rambling on this podcast. It's more than welcome. No, it's interesting. I mean, I wouldn't say, obviously, I didn't get a degree in science. As people know, I got a degree in English and only a bachelor's at that. I did consider grad school for a while, but then I realized what you did is I don't want to teach. What do I want to do? I'm not going to be a TA. I'd have to read other people's crappy papers, like the freshman papers. Like, no, not my style. And by then, I don't know. I mean, that was 5 or 6 years ago, and I've kind of fallen. And since the pandemic, I've not even thought of. I know people who are going to grad school, but I don't think I could do it.
Yeah, a lot of it's online right now, I guess.
Right, apparently. There's a couple colleges near me, but anyway. Well, not... Yep. Yeah. No, it's fine. I'm just trying to refocus, because we're not here to talk about school, necessarily. At least, it's not the worst thing in the world. But the interesting thing here is that I had this kind of, with my background, my parents... both physics professors when I was a kid. My mom retired fairly quickly from that and got other jobs. But both physics teachers originally, and the physics runs in my family. Let me put it that way. But I ended up, I have a lot of that influence, right? And I have a lot of people I can refer to when it comes to physical sciences, for research and stuff. But it's not the most, but I was going to say, I think it's rubbed off on me a little bit, but obviously not to the degree of somebody who eats, sleeps, and breathes that stuff like a grad student would, So what kind of science do you find slipping into your urban fantasy? I think that's interesting.
A lot of it is in creature building. And systems development. So, like when I mean systems development, I mean
like magic systems.
A little bit the magic systems, but for like giving just a ballpark example, imagine you've got a vampire or a dragon or name a magical creature that you put in any novel. Mm-hmm. Well, especially when you're doing urban fantasy, the real trick is that I think urban fantasy got a really bad rap early on because people thought urban fantasy, this is going to be a piece of cake. I don't have to build this massive fantasy world. All I have to do is stick monsters and magic into the real world. There are microwaves, piece of cake. And it's actually deceptively hard because, of course, magic isn't real. Monsters aren't real. So how do you take monsters and magic and, these cool things that don't exist, shove them into our world, and make it seem like it could be real, and I think, I hate relying on myself as example, so I like to use other authors. So giving a couple examples like Kim Harrison, who's a huge urban fantasy author, probably one of the most famous. She did a brilliant job, introducing why aren't monsters and vampires and all these creatures taking over the world? Why are the elves not running things? And she introduced these cool viruses that attacked, the witches and vampires and magical creatures and forced them out of the closet, to a huge degree. And that's a very brilliant piece of adding in some science, and some realistic looking science to make your fantasy world a little more believable. You know, Patricia Briggs with her series does that quite a bit as well. You know, and you know, even Jim Butcher, where you know you've got a lot of, he's already keeps it quite real, I find, in his series, but you know, his magic system as well. One of the hallmarks of science is that, you know, and you would know this from having parents who are physicists, is that energy matter in equals matter out. There's got to be a cost.
The equation has to be balanced,
Yeah, resources or energy, you know, things have to, everything in our world, there is a cost to building, to making, and the real, you know, the you know, details aside, I find that the real greats of urban fantasy are brilliant at balancing the scales. And they do it in such a real way that you suspend your, you know, you suspend your disbelief while you're reading, because it does feel real. And I aspire to do that with my science background in my urban fantasy, and I cross my fingers and hope that I you know, achieve it half as well as, you know, or a fraction as well as those guys do. But I think that's probably where the real science comes in. Maybe a bit rambling, trying to get to the...
No, that's okay. That's okay.
But it's the balances. And I do tend to, without thinking it, add a lot of genetics and cell biology. And so, and again, I'm not really thinking about it because I can't get rid of my science background. I know what, you know, what does some cellular decomposition look like? What are the problems you've got with, you know, a carcass that you might be looking at? I did a bit of ecology back in my early undergrad days. So what are the kinds of things you have to worry about? And I'll often take that to a genetic or cellular level. And it's not that I'm trying to do it or trying to show off. It's just like, oh yeah, so these kinds of genes would be important, or this cellular process would be important. So I find that it good or not, it creeps its way into my writing.
Well, that's kind of interesting on just a general level of what regard, because lately I don't know if you plot or if you are a gardener, basically, when it comes to your production, your actual story building. But when I build a story, I am very much like, I'm going to build this world, because I mostly do secondary worlds. So I'm going to build a world, and then I'll put some characters in it, and then we'll just launch them and see where they go.
Yeah.
And I kind of don't... I usually have a kind of an idea of what I want the story to be. The genre is going to kind of dictate that a little bit. But I don't think consciously about a lot of the stuff that I put in my book when I'm actually doing it.
Yeah.
You know, if I do, I'm going to crash. I can't do that at the same time as writing it, you know? It's not going to happen. Not the way it needs to. And there's some good examples. Actually, the first book I self-published. I indie published this book that's no longer published. And if it ever releases again, it'll be under a new name and be much better. Because that book was very difficult. I was trying to do this thing where I had this book, Death is No Obstacle, which is a book of interviews that Colin Greenland did with Michael Moorcock, the fantasy author. Yep. They're both authors, though. I guess both fantasy authors, too. But anyway... This book is, and in this book, Michael Moorcock describes how he would write a book in 4 days. You know, 60,000 word fantasy novel, 4 days. You know, and I'm like, I can do that. I should be able to do that. I mean, especially he's talking 60,000 words. And my best word count is actually 15,000 words in a day. At one point, though before at that point it was only 12,000. I'd only done 12K in a day before at that point. But I'm like, I bet I can go there. I bet I can do it. And I couldn't. That's the bottom line. I didn't do it that time, at least. But and the book that resulted was very stilted and actually had a lot of problems. So even though I independently published it, this was maybe my 15th novel, and it was such a mess that it was my first big novel. And I can say that it was my book. I unpublished it because it wasn't working. But it's one of those things that when you're indie publishing, at least, one of the best ways to learn about how a book works is to publish it, which is not a great, maybe use a pen name if you're going to do that. If this is your first try, because if it doesn't work, you might want to cover your butt, but it's one of those things that I know Cameron Hurley's talked about this too. Cameron, where she said, if you don't publish a book, once you publish a book, the game changes basically. So did you find that was true? I guess I've been babbling a bit much.
No. It's no. I don't worry. I'm listening. And it's it brings up because the self-publishing ecosystem is so it obviously it shares a lot of commonality with the traditionally published. You still got to worry about your own publicity, a lot of your own marketing. You've got to hit the pavement just as much as a lot of the self-published authors, and it's becoming more so. But there are things that you just don't even have to think about, or that the control of it is taken over by a marketing and publishing wing for good reason,
right?
Because they're investing the money up front. They have a marketing plan, so there's a lot of differences, and there benefits and costs to both systems.
Right.
And one of the things that, when it came to query lettering, for sure, just sending it out there and doing it is, there's only so much you can really think about a query letter. I see a lot of authors who are wanting to go the traditional route who spend an awful lot of time worrying about their query letters.
Oh, I did that for a while.
So much so that they're not sending them out. Not realizing that, there is an art to writing a perfect query letter, but at the end of the day, agents are looking for authors that they can represent. So it still is, have a decent business style query letter, but it's the book and the material that's going to really matter. I find too that with query letters, I put a fair bit of myself into it, and that was a piece of advice I got from from a more experienced author, because it's got to represent you and your writing to a degree. So, as far as everything else, you learned it as, I guess it is true, you do learn it as you go. You learn the editorial process, you learn how covers get designed. You have no say in it, but you learn how it happens. You learn about, naming the books and the different types of strategies. You do learn all that as you go along. So I guess you're right. Yeah, you've got to just get in and do it.
Yeah, I mean, it obviously got double when you're an indie, because indie is, even though it's almost scarier as an indie, even though I dreaded it less than submitting to publishers by the time I decided to go independently independently publishing, because I just was I didn't actually even submit that much, so I guess I think I'd be better at it now. I was just so afraid of getting rejected, but now I'm like, I get rejected all the time by readers every day. People reject my books, I know it, because I have ads out there that are getting clicks that don't always end up in a sale, So it's not as painful anymore. I bet I could make I could try a run at traditional publishing if I had a book now. I'm not saying like you can do it, I can do it. No, I'm saying like I'd be better at that now than when I last tried it. That's all I'm thinking. Because it's been a while.
Well, I think it's, I think there's that point too where you're seeing, and we were talking earlier. Of course, I listened to and enjoyed your episode with Gil Carringer. That was on a couple weeks ago.
A month ago, I think a month or two.
Ago.
Yeah.
A month ago. And she's a very, very well-respected and very successful traditionally published author who has gone indie,
and she's a hybrid.
Seeing that more and more now, where we're having to learn. I'd be lying if I said I don't pay attention and I'm not trying to learn about self-publishing, because that seems to be, as much as I do enjoy doing traditionally published stuff, and we could talk about what I enjoy about it, but or the specific things. I like working with editors, but it's we're all I think going that hybrid direction in the near future, because the industry has just changed so
it's kind
much.
of a convergence.
Not to throw shade at traditional publishing.
Absolutely.
And I don't want it to be construed that way, because I do love traditionally published, the traditionally published pathway, and I plan on doing it again and again. But I'm seeing more and more of my colleagues and authors I really admire. the kinds I aspire to, who are putting out their own short stories. And so watching that, I think every traditionally published author now is going, okay, I better be watching and I better be learning.
Right. And you can tell some of the ones who did because they can really capitalize on things like this. Like what was it, Brandon Sanderson with his he had his Kickstarter for the leather-bound edition, limited edition, and that made him a millionaire if he wasn't already.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
That's incredible, and that's one set of rights that he just like, I'll keep those. Just keep me those, will you? Agent, or presumably told his agent to help him keep those. I don't know. And then he capitalized on it, on this little detail very well, because he's so big for one thing, but also because he is the world's largest hobbit, and I can say that. I met the man a long time ago. But he's I think he's taller than me. He's pretty tall anyway. And yet his demeanor was very friendly. That's why I say the world's largest hobbit. Anyway, let me see though. What my point was though, that even one of the biggest authors in the world, in the fantasy genre at least, went off and he hybridized a little bit, and he's done some novellas and stuff independently as well. So,
well, and this might be something really interesting to your listeners.
Sure.
if they're thinking about traditional or self-publishing, something that I've been seeing, and I'm not going to say names or anything, but something that I am seeing a trend of now, and I've seen it on Twitter, I've seen it with authors I follow, they're just starting to get their rights back from traditional publishing houses. As in, they're not having to pay any money. The traditional publishing houses are just saying, yeah, I guess we don't need this on our catalog anymore. Here you go. Here's your backlist. You can just have it. And so under those scenarios, it's like, yeah, what do you do with those afterwards? I guess you self-publish them. So, I think that's another sort of thing that people who are in the traditional world, or authors who are considering going that traditional route, need to be aware that even if you go the traditional route, in 5 to 10 years, you might get your back catalog. Or you'll get your
rights back to the old stuff, the older books. Yeah. Now that's very intriguing, because I have heard for many years that it used to be very much the opposite. That that publishers would take the rights for almost, they would take the rights they got from you for a long time, if not in perpetuity. But that is really good news. I could see that making traditional publishing a lot more attractive to some of the big indies too. Because some of these indies have very large audiences and are very successful, even though they're probably still small compared to the biggest traditional authors, just because different scales here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I kind of wonder if I wonder if there's something about it where they're doing the math on the back end and they're realizing that at a certain sales point, even if a book is doing okay, after a certain amount of time, it actually is costing them more money to keep it on their catalog than it is to just give it back. Because, of course, if you're a publishing house, you've got your accounting department. How much does it cost to process that $1,000 royalty check that somebody's getting on, or whatever that dollar value is, for some of the mid-list. It's an interesting observation that I've made. So.
Yeah, well, but even while that may result in some challenges for those authors, so those mid-list authors who are those books are basically effectively going out of print with the publisher, it also presents some interesting opportunities.
Oh, gosh,
so I think that's really cool, and I'm glad to hear that, because I haven't heard much from the traditional publishing world. I haven't been paying that much attention to it for maybe 7 years. So. Yeah, that's interesting. Because originally I wanted to be. I tried to be traditionally published all through my teen years and early 20s, and I kind of just said, I think indie might be a good way to try it. So I tried that. I've been trying that ever since. Mm-hmm. But it's a tough road, let me tell you. Not everybody is, like some of my guests on here, like a Michael Anderle or some. And Michael Anderle, he just worked his butt off. That's how that guy got his success. Let's be fair here. 26 books in 2 years or whatever. That's not a coincidence that you become successful and you write that many books and get them all out there. Anyway, or however many he did. I think he was at least 25. some insane, is all in one series, just this insane mega series he created in the course of about the same time I was writing my longest novel. He started writing that series, and it's still going, I think, which is nuts. But anyway, fiction factories aside, human-shaped fiction factories. What I do have some questions about reading, because we actually are. This conversation's been fascinating, but my show only runs half an hour for the most part.
Okay.
So,
no worries.
So I'm just kind of curious about, because you mentioned reading earlier, and you mentioned, but actually, let's make a pit stop. Sorry, because you mentioned learning how to title books, how books get titled. I'm very curious about this, and and I know we're winding back a little bit here.
Oh yeah, no worries.
But how do traditional publishers decide on the titles for books? I mean, they have a lot of the power over it, right?
They have, like, I mean, if you are one of their A-list authors, I'm sure that you get to pick. You have say over your cover, your title, your back, like all the design. But if you're starting out, you've produced a book, and one of the benefits is you get to work with world-class editors. My experience was, I basically, because we both have some academic background, it was like I was getting paid to do a master's class in editing to a degree, or how to edit my own writing and where my weaknesses and,
what a blessing.
And strengths were. It was amazing. I got to work with Ann Collins and Amanda Betts at Random House in Canada, who are superstars, and then Sean Makiewicz, who is with Simon & Schuster, through Simon & Schuster, who works on the Walking Dead graphic novel, or he was working, I don't know if he still is, and as well Adam Wilson, who's an urban fantasy superstar editor. I think he's moved houses a little bit. So I learned so much about just from somebody who had no background in the English world. I caught up really quickly, which was awesome, and I can appreciate the academic element to that. But covers and titles, you have no say. You have no say. My first series, they liked the title, so I guess I had this misconception that I would that with my second series that I'll have a say in the title, and I had some input in the title, but and I did have final say, from a list of options, and we threw some things around. But originally, I named my Kincaid book Dead and Drowned Seattle, because I was going with a bit of a Kim Harrison vibe. We're aiming for more of a Kim Harrison vibe on that. And they basically shook their marketing department. And again, these are people who are studying the market. They know what titles do. They know what people... It's not like they're just saying no for no reason. They're looking at the demographic. They're looking at what has done well. They're looking at what's going to give them the best chance. And the Voodoo Killings was what we ended up deciding on. Sort of one of the titles they presented. And because it was easy to name the rest of the series. So we were able to do... So it was the Voodoo Killings, Lipstick Voodoo, and then Voodoo Shanghai. So it was obvious, the series progression.
Yes, the series is like the Voodoo series or whatever.
The Voodoo series.
At least people could think of it in those terms.
And you can recognize it that way. Even though there's not actually much voodoo in the book.
Oh, so it's not one of those...
Tangentially, it's tangential. It's in there, but it's not... it's not like a historical thing. It's a grunge rocker, a practitioner who raises the dead in Seattle, who lives with the ghost of a deceased grunge rocker, which turned, which became a voodoo practitioner who lives in Seattle with the ghost of a grunge rocker.
Okay.
And so there's voodoo element in it, but as respectfully as possible, I borrowed from it, but it's, again, the marketing department and just what they would be able to sell and what would look snappy, what would be memorable, and that's all things that they were looking at. So and same with the cover too. We actually went through two different covers because they felt the first one was missing out on the urban fantasy market, and they were probably right on that. So we had one title. So there are actually two titles for my first Voodoo Killings book. Because when the second book came out, they did a relaunch on the first title.
Wow.
Or
Okay.
the first cover.
The cover, yeah, 2 covers out. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I went through so many covers for some of my early books because I make my own covers, so I can just churn out a new cover. I probably mentioned this before, but I make my on other shows. But it is really nice to be able to do that myself. I mean, having learned some Photoshop, I mean, my covers are not super pretty necessarily, but they work. They get the job done when I get the books out in the proper time frame anyway. Mm-hmm. But so I guess but the titles, I've always been like, what am I going to call this? And there's this kind of strategy in the indie world, which is like, let's just name it whatever the book is. Just pick the most obvious thing that's going to have some keywords that are going to draw people in, draw readers of your genre in. And that's how I ended up with like the Demon Scroll, which is in my epic fantasy series, which is probably a little bit off because it feels like maybe the Demon Hunter thing should be an urban fantasy series, but oh well, live and learn. That was Anyway,
I think something that's easy to remember too.
Yeah.
Is really like Wool, Hugh Howey's Wool.
Right. Yeah.
Everybody remembers that title. So, yeah.
Hugh Howey's got some good one-word titles, Wool and Dust, and those are the ones that come to mind anyway. I don't know. Has he been publishing much lately? Anyway, should just Google that later. Anyway, so Kristi, what have you been reading lately? Yeah, what have you been reading lately?
So, ever since, most of my stuff is audiobook now. Because I find that with writing and also with managing my toddler, the only time I can get substantial reading done is when I'm walking around the kitchen or doing other tasks or something. So these are books I've really enjoyed, and I thought the narration was spot on too. For those of you who like narration, another Canadian author, since I'm Canadian, I want to put that plug in. Hench by Natalie Zena Walshots is wonderful. It is a superhero, supervillain style novel. So it's kind of in that the superhero genre. And,
like Soon I Will.
The Henchmen.
That kind of reminds you of Soon I Will Be Invincible. That book, it came out when I was 10 years ago or so. I think I have a copy around here somewhere.
Yeah, similar genre for sure. So I highly recommend Hench. Another one that I have been reading recently and is another Canadian author is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia.
Oh, I've heard good things about that.
Quite good. I'm a fan of her work. So I always try and recommend those. And another one of my all-time favorite authors who's American is Peter Clines, who does some wonderful science fiction. The Fold and Dead Moon are 2 of his books that I recommend. 2 of my favorites. So
was his first book 13? Was that the one? The one which is kind of like 14. 14. Sorry, I was off by one.
I don't think that was his first.
It was one of his early books, though. I remember hearing about that years ago. I have a copy. I got a copy of that at a convention. I still haven't been able to. I haven't taken the time to crack it open. It was on one of those giveaway tables, right, where it's like take a book, leave a book, and that was the one I took.
Yeah, and for urban fantasy people out there, an older series, but highly recommend from a UK author, Ben Aronovich, his series. So I'm reading Moon Over Soho right now, and that's a wonderful urban fantasy for those out there who haven't heard of him. So
wonderful.
Haven't picked him up yet. Yeah,
I have a couple of recommendations too, actually. Though currently, I'm first going to recommend. This is actually a book that I picked up back in college, and this is going to date my college career a little bit. But when I was taking human geography, I think it was back in college. So it wasn't human geography. It was anthropology. So I took both those classes. I got mixed up. But for anthropology, I got an ethnography of Wall Street. It's called Liquidated by Karen Ho, and it came out just after. It came out in like 2009 or 2010. So like right after the big Wall Street collapse in the United States, or it was worldwide basically. But this huge disaster financially, and it's a very fascinating book. And I read it back then, but I'm rereading it, so I figured I'd recommend it. That's nonfiction, of course. But it is very interesting, especially because I like writing systems that are very advanced, even in a fairly primitive fantasy setting. I like to have an advanced social system, and that book describes some very weird social systems. Let me put it that way. And then, of course, we got, as on the fiction side for me, I've got. I do have the Gods of Mars on my to read pile, which is an old pulp novel by not Edgar. I forget his name. Jeez, it's the guy who wrote Tarzan. Is that Edgar Burroughs? Edgar Rice Burroughs? I think it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Edgar
Jeez,
Rice Burroughs.
I got mixed up. I was just like, that can't be right, can it? No, that was him. He wrote the John Carter of Mars movies was based on these books. Yeah.
Well. Yep.
Yeah, and this is the sequel, the second of those books. The Princess of Mars is the first one, and the Gods of Mars is the second one. And I just cracked that open the other day. And then I got Noble House sitting on my actual night table, but I haven't looked at that. I haven't actually opened that book in a while. Noble House by James Clavell, which is...
I love James Clavell.
James Clavell is really good. He's a really good writer. His books are very intimidatingly large. Let me put it that way. Even in paperback, this book is almost the size. It's as big as my hand, which is is saying a lot. It's big as my spread fingers, way thicker.
Noble House was wonderful. I have to say King Rat is still my favorite.
Okay, I need to check that out. That's another Shanghai one, right? Not Shanghai, Hong Kong.
No, it's the semi-autobiographical internment camp story it's been years since I've read it. I'm going to say Japanese internment.
Oh, probably, because most of these books are East Asian in
it's
focus.
definitely East Asia. I'm just trying to remember what.
So probably Japanese, because
World War II.
World War II, Japanese internment with soldiers. I know when I was a teenager, my brother read Shogun, but we've been playing this video game Shogun Total War before that, and so he thought and we've really been into samurai and stuff like that as kids, like learning all about that stuff. And it's funny because then he's like, well, I kind of already knew all this stuff, and then. Yeah, so he wasn't quite as impressed with it as I think a lot of people are, because the research fell a little flat with him because he already knew a ton of it, if not all of it, from other stuff he'd been learning. But James Clavell is a hell of a writer, and he's wonderful. His books are really fun, and he does some really kind of ambitious, weird stuff at times. And I noticed in Noble House, there's this scene where it starts off from the perspective of the white businesswoman. And that the European or American, I guess, white businesswoman, and she's in, and she's going to, and she's in her hotel room, and she's talking, and then gradually the scene just kind of shifts point of view till we're with the help, the people, the Chinese, the Hong Kong people who are cleaning her hotel room and talking about her behind her back, and it's pretty great. But it's also it's just like, when did this change? I didn't even notice that was happening. It's great, phenomenal stuff. Anyway. Yeah, so Kristi, thanks for being on the show. We ran a little late, but I'm happy we did.
Oh, no, thanks so much for having me, Tim. This was a load of fun.
Oh, excellent. So, Kristi, tell people where they can find your books. I guess being traditionally published, they're going to be just about everywhere. But let people know.
Amazon, the library, and worst case scenario, you can always look up my website or my Twitter. But yeah, bookstores, Amazon, library. Library's a great place to find books.
Oh, yeah.
I recommend people find them at the library.
That is extremely noble of you, I would say, because many authors go there, even very fun authors who are very good people, I'm sure, will say, you should go buy my book, but not everyone needs that. So anyway, it's just, because I support your local library, folks. I got to say you got to keep them alive.
They buy our books.
Exactly, they buy books too, folks. Yeah, exactly. So thanks once again, Kristi. It's been fun, and. Thanks, and as for this podcast, you can find us at mentalcellularpublications.com. You can find my books on Amazon.com, and currently the latest of those is Well Country. But I've got some secret projects in the works, so who knows? Watch this space, or I should say listen, because you can't see me. But listen here, and I'll let you know when new books come out. But also, you can sign up for my newsletter on the website, which is the same one I just mentioned. I am going in circles. Thanks for listening, everybody. Stay safe. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
That tears it.